Hello, archaeology enthusiasts. I'm going to be discussing wound identification on ancient remains. I will be going over the discovery and excavation of King Richard III and 3 medieval burial sites in Cambridge, England, and discussing a cause of death theory for King Tutankhamen, and 2 excavations of Roman Imperial age burial sites. King Richard III, which is mostly the focus of this presentation. King Richard III was killed in the Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485. He was the last English king to die in battle, probably because the monarchies were starting to run out of the male heirs. Take a second and just look at the remains in the ground. Do you see the spine? It's a little odd. His skeleton was unearthed on September 4, 2012. The remains were located under a car park in the city of Leicester, because his original place of rest was the Church of the Grey Friars, but the church was demolished during the reign of Henry VIII, because he liked to destroy things. The skeleton was a delicate build with severe scoliosis of the thoracic spine, which is very noticeable in this image. A dry bone analysis gave the age range between 20s to the 30s, but a more precise aging technique using the rib end analysis, cranial sutures, and pubic symphyseal, the age range was narrowed down to 30 to 34. So, King Richard III was 32 at the time of his death, was of delicate build, and had a raised right shoulder because of his severe scoliosis. DNA sampling was also performed against known descendants, and alongside carbon dating, placing the bones from 1455 to 1540. King Richard III was wearing traditional armor, but had been unhorsed and had lost his helmet based on his injuries. 11 injuries were identified. 3 of those injuries could have been cause of death. And to note, 9 of the 11 injuries were just to the head alone. 2 of the possible fatal injuries were to the skull, while the other was to the pelvis. There were no injuries to his arms, of course, because he was fully armored. But the pelvis has to have movability so that it's not as armored as other places. His pelvis injury, though, is hypothesized to be postmortem. The 2 skull injuries are located on the cranial floor or the base of the skull. In the inferior view of the skull, you can see the rather large opening in the occipital bone and the other hole located in the jugular foramen, which was a penetrating wound. Both skull injuries would have been fatal, but the cause of the killing blow is inconclusive because you cannot see the overlapping. King Richard III's body would have been paraded and displayed for days to deter other successors. All this information was obtained through the article called Perimortem Trauma in King Richard III, a Skeletal Analysis. Cambridge, England excavation. 3 locations were selected in Cambridge, England by the research article called Medieval Injuries, Skeletal Trauma as an Indicator of Past Living Conditions and Hazard Risk in Cambridge, England. All Saints by the Castle had 84 skeletal remains exhumed for examination. This was the place of rest for the normal individuals of society. The skeletal remains exhibited the most fractured injuries, mostly antemortem and mostly male. All Saints' burial location was the average able-bodied person that worked in society and exposed themselves the most to possible injury, so they should logically show the most injuries on their skeletal remains. The Hospital of St. John the Evangelist had 155 remains exhumed for examination. The hospital was the impoverished or the chronically ill. The hospital was of frail individuals and that did not participate in manual labor, so their skeletal remains didn't show a lot of injuries. The Augustinian friar had 75 skeletal remains exhumed for examination. The friar was the burial location for the friars, of course, and the wealthy citizens. The Augustinian friar was obviously men of God and wealthy people that did not have to participate in hard manual labor, so their skeletal remains were older. Tutankhamen. It was hypothesized that King Tutankhamen was murdered by a blow to the head because of the debris located in the skull. In the article, the skull and cervical spine radiographs of Tutankhamen, a critical appraisal. An additional look into the scans of King Tut was done. It is determined that the skull fragment was not perimortem, but possibly inflicted during the mummification process, or most likely during the dissection and autopsy performed in 1925. The thinning of the posterior fossa that was noted was determined to be normal and not the cause of death. It is suggested, based on the article written in the science.org titled "Blow to the Head Didn't Kill King Tut," that King Tut succumbed to infection after a serious accident that broke his left femur. At the time of death, King Tut was noted to have 2 broken legs, according to the CT scan that was performed on his remains. This still does not rule out foul play, it just rules out blunt force trauma to the head, and provides another clue to the mystery of King Tut's death. Roman Imperial Age excavation. 2 locations were excavated and discussed in the Journal of Paleopathy of Human Remains from the Roman Imperial Age: the Colatina necropolis and the Osteria del Corato necropolis. It was discovered during excavation that more rural location of Osteria del Corato resulted in more trauma and periotosis in its residents, and the more urban location of Colatina had more diseases because of the large population that influenced poor sanitation and hygiene. The diseases included metabolic disease such as osteoporosis, rickets, and scurvy, and infectious diseases such as tuberculosis. No matter how long someone has passed from the world, their remains continue to tell the story of how they lived. It is almost as if the bones speak. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you were able to learn something interesting like I did.